So thank you all for joining today. I'm so excited to talk to you. It's wonderful to see so many people in the room. I hope you all have been having a good day so far. My name is Wendy Robinson. I will be talking to you today about the importance of language access in emergency preparedness. This is something I'm really passionate about. I work in the emergency management space in lovely Washington, D.C. So I'm hoping to draw on some of my experiences, some of my knowledge, and share it with you. I also want this to be very interactive. So please, if you have questions, comments, I do want this to be kind of conversational. So I'll walk through my presentation, but of course, if you have any questions, I do have the chat box open. Feel free to just shout your question or comment, and I'll be happy to answer it to the best of my ability. And then if you have some experience in dealing with emergencies or disasters in your work or in your own life, I'd be interested to hear it as well. This will be mostly from a US perspective, as I'm an American, but I would love to hear about your experiences and knowledge as well. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to walk through some key terms here to kind of start us off and get a feel for what I'm talking about in terms of emergency management and language access. There's really two types of emergencies. One is more nature-based, it happens as sort of an act of God. It can be things like tornadoes, hurricanes, dust storms, forest fires, that kind of thing. And then there's also man-made incidents, things like gas explosions, terrorist attacks, school shootings, things that are caused by humans. So what do I mean by emergency management? So that's essentially the managing of disasters or emergencies from kind of the top government level down to the local community level. And it focuses on managing those disasters before, during, and after they happen. That whole process is very important in terms of responding to those kinds of incidents. And so what do I mean by language access? It's essentially the ability to obtain information and resources in one's native language. And I stress the use of native language because when you're in an emergency situation, you hear that there's some kind of storm coming. When you're hearing all of this information in something other than your native language, let's say a language you speak kind of well, or maybe you're fluent, you consider yourself fluent, but it's not your native language, you might still misunderstand what's happening, or you might get confused, or when you're feeling panic and your mind seizes, then it'll be harder to know what's happening. So language access is being able to have access to information and resources, critical resources you need during an emergency. So I really wish you could see my map, but I'll do my best to describe it. So some of you may have seen on the news recently, last week, actually, a really bad hurricane hit the southeastern coast of Florida. So if you picture the United States as kind of like a weird shaped rectangle, and so it hit, and I might be reversed on your screen, but it hit the eastern kind of seaboard going south. There's kind of like that little tip. Florida, maybe some of you have been to Miami or have wanted to go. So Miami is in Florida, and this hurricane has really devastated the United States, and it's also devastated Cuba. The entire country of Cuba was actually out of power because of this hurricane. And in terms of Florida and a few other states that the hurricane has really impacted, we've seen 88 people dead, and I think that number is still counting. Over 40,000 people have been displaced from their homes, meaning, that their homes have been leveled, they can't return to it. Maybe the homes have been flooded. It's just really devastating. And so why I'm mentioning this hurricane is not only because it's interesting to me and to the work that I'm doing, but it's also critical in terms of understanding language access right now. This is an event that happened last week, and we know that certain populations will be impacted in terms of accessing information. Florida is extremely diverse, extremely multicultural, and in fact, the whole of the eastern side of the United States is heavily populated and very multicultural. So in that way, this is very relevant. 45% of South Florida's residents speak a language other than English at home, which is a huge number, 45% of just Southern Florida. And then according to a 2013 US Census Bureau survey, over 27% of Florida's residents speak a language other than English. And as we know that the population booms, it'll continue to get bigger and bigger. Even just talking about Florida, then we know that percentage will most likely increase. And so when we zoom onto that population, who makes up that 27% or 45%? It's Hispanic populations, it's Israelis who have immigrated and they speak Hebrew, it's Creole speakers, Somalis, and other languages from Africa. There's a whole diverse range, Hindi speakers as well, Bengali speakers. How does the US government and how do local communities access important information with so many languages and so many cultures at play? So while there's, successes and opportunities and modern technologies that have been developed to help people get the information that they need on time before the disaster hits, there's still a far ways to go. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but I just kind of wanted to give you first an example of what's happening right now and how can we imagine that language access will be impacted by the disaster and what we know today. So really wish you could see my map, but if anybody is really interested, I'm more than happy to email this slide deck to you after the presentation. So any questions or comments thus far? I'm looking in the chat. It's okay if you're quiet and just want to take it all in, but please feel free to shout something if you want. Otherwise, I'll just keep rolling. So the next thing that I want us to consider is, what do those risks and challenges look like during an emergency? And this is something I've already alluded to in terms of having that panic feeling, an emergency, a situation is coming, a hurricane, a tornado, a typhoon. And what happens next? What happens if you can't access the information you need in your native language and the information you're seeing maybe is confusing? You're really not sure what some of those words mean. One of the big challenges and big risks in terms of not having effective language access is not having a clear understanding of the disaster specific terminology. And of course, it makes sense. People coming from other parts of the world, they've immigrated to, let's say, Florida, good example, and are not familiar with a hurricane. Maybe they're coming from a more dry, arid environment. So how can they understand what a hurricane might be, how severe it is, who they need to reach out to, how they need to respond, what they should pack with them, and where they can go for safety, where they can find a shelter. So a lot of these aspects and things to think about, and considerations really, are very important and can be more of a challenge to follow in case of disaster. And if you're not sure who you need to speak to, where you need to go for your information, it'll be harder to get those resources and supplies. Let's say, you're hunkering down in a shelter, with your family, and you don't know where you need to go or who you need to call. The emergency alerts that you're getting on your phone are actually only in English, so you're not sure how to follow. And you know that you need food and safe drinking water. So this is going to be a serious challenge and maybe can cause a greater risk. I mean, people have died or been seriously injured not getting the information they need on time and correct information too. So there can be misunderstandings of the information and how severe the emergency is as well. So I do want to talk to you about a few examples in terms of carrying on with the challenges, and I promise we'll get to the successes too. We'll talk about positive things as well. But in terms of kind of lessons learned and challenges and risks that have happened, failures, I have some great examples to walk through. So in 2013, there were the Oklahoma tornadoes. So if you picture rectangle United States, Oklahoma is pretty much right in the center. It's a very dry, very flat part of the US. So tornadoes happen very easily because there's no mountains to kind of block that movement. And so people coming from other parts of the world may not be used to that kind of environment. And so it may be challenging to know how to be safe and how to get out of a danger zone when needed. Unfortunately, during that tornado in 2013, over 20 Guatemalans actually perished during the storm. A whole family, I think a family of 7 actually sheltered down in a storm drain, which is one of the last places you should actually shelter down. You need to go to higher ground in case of a tornado so that you're safer, it's more protective. But they sheltered down in a storm drain and were killed. And they actually didn't have access to the information they needed in Spanish. Otherwise, maybe they would have known and that those deaths would have been preventable. So just imagine that there may have been confusion and panic, and just not having the information they needed really caused this. So it's a tragic loss. Another example of kind of a different situation with Hurricane Katrina. There is and was a large Vietnamese community living in New Orleans, which was badly devastated by Hurricane Katrina. And so just a quick summary of Hurricane Katrina. Maybe some of you have heard of this. This was a Category 5 hurricane, the worst that you can possibly have. It devastated the region. Over millions of people were displaced from their homes. Many have not returned. And I think the death toll was somewhere around 1,800 people, which is a lot. That's really devastating. And so during Hurricane Katrina, there was a large Vietnamese speaking community living in New Orleans. Many did not evacuate because they were also not receiving the information they needed. Most of the English and most of the information, if not all of the information, was in English. So they weren't able to access the resources they need, the supplies, having evacuation order information, basically where and how to get out and who do they need to talk to. In the Vietnamese community, there is also a sense of cultural pride for some people who did not speak English. They didn't want to admit that, so they weren't able to get those resources. So it really devastated their community. I have a really key quote here. So many, about 2/3, reported lack of information as a problem, with 1/4 of the people reporting a lot or extreme information gaps. And 93% of Vietnamese Americans spoke Vietnamese at home, 65% did not speak English very well, and 44% were linguistically isolated. So just to kind of explain that, linguistically isolated really means, you're speaking your native language at home. The people around you are also speaking the same language. There's not as much exposure to English. A lot of the Vietnamese community were actually working in the fishing industry, and working with other Vietnamese. What I have here on my slide deck that you can't see is a really cool sign that demonstrates how signs in this community for fishing were actually in English and Vietnamese. So that linguistic isolation made it all the more challenging to access the information they needed. But I do have a positive story about Hurricane Katrina related to this community that I'll mention very shortly. But another example I have for you is a more international one. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Gorkha earthquake or the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. There's other misunderstandings and confusion that can arise that's not purely linguistic, but it is connected. There's sort of an understanding of how those disasters can happen and how relief workers can communicate with locals to give them aid and to make sure they're in safe places, and also to provide supplies and food. So an interesting quote I have here is about how the perception of how the earthquake works and how it's dangerous or not is very interesting. So linguist Christine Hildebrandt reported that local people believe that earthquakes happen when things fall out of balance, and that earthquakes are viewed as karmic payback for too much modernizing or for sin for taking economic assistance from China. So having a different perception of how that earthquake comes about and how it's destructive is really interesting, because it's, from a Nepalese perspective, it's more like, this is going to happen anyway, you know, this is my fate, this is what I have to deal with, rather than thinking, okay, there's an emergency, it's going to be really bad, I need to get out, save my family, save myself, you know, bring some food and water with me, that kind of reaction. So having a different perception means a different reaction to an emergency. Another interesting thing that I read about the Nepal earthquake was also having a different perception of directions and kind of spatial language. So things like up, down, left, right. Imagine a relief worker is trying to give instructions on how to get to a safer place, you know, that may not have been destroyed by the earthquake. Giving directions in that sense may be difficult, because a Western perception of giving directions is going to be very different linguistically. So that's definitely a challenge that the international community may face in terms of providing aid for disasters like that. And I promised I would say some happy stories as well. Well, not happy, but successful stories of how successful language access implementation has really helped communities. And granted, sometimes it is trial and error. Sometimes some communities have had to undergo a lot in order to find a better way that works. So I mentioned Hurricane Katrina on the last slide that you can't see. There was this organization, and it's still functional, called Boat People SOS. So when the war in Vietnam was happening in the 1980s, this organization was helping people, essentially saving them from the ocean, giving them homes, finding homes for them, helping with paperwork and documentation, settling children in schools, helping people find jobs, and really just helping them recoup after fleeing from their countries. And this organization started back up during Hurricane Katrina to provide support, aid, translation, and interpreting services to the local Vietnamese community, which helps significantly. Having that linguistic support, but also guidance in terms of how to find a safe place to shelter, where to find food, the basics that I've been mentioning was really helpful. And it also helped Vietnamese members of the community not only find safe places to go after they've been displaced and their homes have been leveled, but also being able to come back to New Orleans and move back and come home, essentially. So this organization was really instrumental and does great work in that area. Another positive example and kind of the lessons learned theme was the California Thomas fires in 2017. Two counties, and it actually leveled multiple counties, but the Sonoma and Ventura counties in Southern California found ways to improve their language access. They realized that Google Translate, as I'm sure all of you might know, is not the ideal way to translate information. There can be misunderstandings. It doesn't always, it rarely works with context, cultural context. And so they found better ways of improving the way that they translated. They brought on bilingual employees and volunteers to help in the emergency response, and were actually really able to help the Spanish-speaking population in those counties. So what we know is that this sort of ad hoc response became more institutionalized in policy. So in fact, on a local county level, language access became very important in terms of implementing disaster plans. So that was another success on a local level. So we had kind of a regional regional, state level, and then we had something on a local county level. And then on a national level, this is going to be a fun acronym for you all, but the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is the United States Agency for Managing Disasters. When I mentioned in the first part of this conversation, emergency management. So that agency manages all of the emergencies in the United States. They launched a warning system in 2011, actually technically 2012. They started it in 2011, called the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, IPAWS, which I know is kind of a mouthful. But what that essentially means is a warning system in preparedness, preparing for emergencies. So you can get these warnings before, during, after emergencies. And the neat thing about this warning system is that, well, it disseminates information in English and other multiple languages. It's specifically so it's easy to use for non-English speakers. So with the United States, English is kind of the primary language. It's technically not the official language. We have no official language, but it is the primary language. So having options in other languages besides English is very, very important for the diverse communities that we have here. And another critical thing about this warning system, it has software that actually provides warnings in indigenous languages. So we have many Native American tribes here in the United States, which have their own indigenous languages. And so we have a system to actually warn them, which is a very important part of our emergency preparedness strategy. This year, the United States actually released an official tribal strategy to help implement positive change and positive, effective policies, I should say, for the tribes in the US. So this goes hand in hand with IPAWS, and I think it's a really exciting step forward. And the whole point of IPAWS is really being able to provide comprehensive and comprehensible information to people who need it as soon as possible. And luckily it works well with technology. So you can get those alerts on your phone, on your computer, on the internet. It's kind of an integrated system and process. So that's another success story on a more national level. So what does the future look like? I've been thinking through recommendations and how language access can continue to be improved upon in emergency preparedness. And I have 3 recommendations and 3 considerations for the future. The first is having community-based training for emergency preparedness. I'm thinking along the lines of what I was telling you all about the Vietnamese community during Hurricane Katrina and some of the other examples I shared. I think it's absolutely critical that communities receive training. Maybe an emergency management expert comes in along with a linguist, an interpreter, or translator to help provide guidance to these communities. And it's important because having somebody guide you who understands how to prepare for those emergencies and is able to work through the cultural context is really key. And I think that goes in hand in hand with having that actual language access, having things in the native language of those people, of those community members, but also having the cultural context is super important. You can't translate things literally because misunderstandings and confusion can arise. I think, as we all know, as passionate polyglots, that's a really easy thing that can be a huge mistake, and it can actually cost lives. So trainings are a really good basis for developing that knowledge. And because oftentimes immigrant communities in the United States, and I'm sure in other parts of the world too, they tend to be very closely knit. It's very much a social network. So having something based in the community and grounded in the community will make a big difference. And then that's also another way to pass the word on about the trainings. Somebody takes it, says it's really good, recommends it to family members, and so on and so forth. And eventually, hopefully, all the communities get those trainings. Another important recommendation for the future is to include language access in every disaster preparedness plan. It seems self-explanatory, but it is really important, especially considering how the world continues to be a melting pot. Now, I think after the pandemic, there's so much flux and movement in populations. So having language access and language awareness, cultural awareness in disaster plans is absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, if there's miscommunication or confusion on a smaller level, it can very much affect the whole community and even the region. So it's kind of a spillover effect. And having this kind of plan, having step-by-step procedures, having a clear-cut communications plan and how to respond, how to communicate with local community members who may not speak, for example, taking the US perspective, may not speak English. How can we reach them? How can we communicate to them the important information that they need to survive if a disaster happens? And the last piece, which is extremely important, I think we know, talking virtually on Zoom, is technology, being able to leverage and use technology. And how can we use it in more creative ways? I mean, iPause is a really great start. What else can we do? So there are some cultures and some communities where information is not necessarily passed on through written messaging. Sometimes it's verbal, through audio. Sometimes it's visual. And sometimes that's just the fastest, easiest way to communicate information. How can we take advantage of that? How can we use that to really spread the message effectively? And imagine if it's visual, maybe that's easier to disseminate to many other languages, because you don't need the use of words. You're using a picture to describe the scenario and what they can do to safeguard themselves during an emergency. So this is really my thoughts on the future and how language access can continue to be important for emergency situations. I know this is a quiet room today, but I would love to hear if you have any questions or even any comments, reactions. I think I've been talking your ear off, but I'm glad to have you all here. So please feel free to ask me any questions or share your experiences, even something on the news that you saw that you thought was interesting. And is this something that you've thought about or maybe experienced on your own? Have you traveled to a foreign country and a situation happened where you needed to immediately get critical information? I mean, it doesn't have to be an emergency, but it can be challenging. Figuring out what you need to do in a foreign language, it can be very intimidating. So I'll pause there and see if anybody has any thoughts. Yes, I see a hand up. Timothy, please.
Okay, thank you very much for a very engaging talk. I'm actually quite glad that your slides weren't working, because it actually felt as if I was talking to you via WhatsApp, like a chat. So
wonderful.
great, yeah. I have sort of two questions.
Please.
One's connected with culture, and one's connected with what we can do as polyglots to help. So you gave the example of Google Translate. Actually, a few days ago, a friend of mine said to me, the problem with Google Translate is it can't translate culture. And
yes.
That was because she was having some difficulties in communicating with her Ukrainian guests who are refugees, and she didn't know how to make them culturally understand something. So my question is, what can obviously cultural awareness is important in language learning. However, I have the impression that people, especially people who learn English, are not encouraged to look at this of cultural aspect when they're learning languages. So how can we incorporate a cultural aspect in order to help people in such situations, and also at the same time give them extra insights into another culture? And my second question is, what can we do as language learners? I know I thought of Moses McCormick. Do you know the Lao Shu 55,000
Yes,
videos?
yes.
Yes, and so it appears to me, that he was actually doing something which could be useful also in disaster situations by going and meeting people in his community, understanding them, and learning how to communicate with them. So what are your thoughts on that? How can we incorporate culture relevant for your purposes into language learning? And the second question is, what can we do, as language learners to make your job easier?
So your questions and comments are so packed with good information, good questions. And I'm also glad you enjoyed not having the slides, and that it was more like a coffee chat, which I appreciate. I like that too. So where to begin? In terms of having that cultural context, I think that's why it's key to have people that have that knowledge come into these situations. So in terms of handling disasters, there's always a core of people that gets deployed to the disaster to handle the logistics of it, handling, giving out supplies, managing the people, figuring out where to put the people, building shelters, rescuing people. There's a lot of focus on that. And while there is some aspect of it where people will come into communities that, let's say, don't speak the native language or the primary language of the region or country or area. But I would say having people that can come in who have the cultural understanding will be really helpful. I mean, we can even take Spanish, how big of a language it is, how broad. There's so many different dialects, and therefore so many different ways to say certain things, so much terminology that can really differ from country to country. And so the challenge is, really providing distinct options for not just languages, but also with the dialects and the terminology and the cultural background in mind. And sometimes there's just not enough resources to provide all those specific details. I mean, for example, take Florida. Is there an interpreter who can go to the disaster who is familiar with, let's say, Guatemalan Spanish, Cuban Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, Spanish from Spain? Maybe not, but having as much information and being able to provide as much support across those dialects is very important. And also finding ways to make that information more understandable. I understand with some languages, it may be difficult to do than others, but actually finding terms that are more easily understandable across dialects. So that's why I mentioned audio and visual, because I do think that's a way to support language when there might be some misunderstandings or some different terms, is having additional guidance, being able to demonstrate things, being able to show things. If somebody can visually see, let's say in a training, somebody can visually see, and it can be a virtual or an in-person training, somebody can see how they need to, let's say, put together a go kit or an emergency kit. Maybe that's confusing. Maybe they won't know what those words are and what that's supposed to sound like. Emergency kit, something with an emergency. What's in it? What is it for? How do I use it? And essentially what it is having all the things you need in case of emergency, being able to put it in one bag and go. But how to put it together? What does it mean? What are the supplies that are needed? Having some visual guidance and having somebody walk you through, I think, is a good way to kind of get around that. And it can cross some of those cultural and linguistic barriers. And apologies, I forgot your second question.
Well, on the topic of the
Polyglot
first
can do?
question, yes, I mean, just one thought that came to mind regarding the first
Sure.
question. I don't know if you're aware of the work of Francesco Reala and his Communicon project, where he tries to make a language out of symbols.
Oh, that's
But
really interesting.
it seemed from what you just said, if you can explain things as visually as possible, then this might be a way of supporting the language aspect as well. Yeah, I think, as I noticed, somebody's just written his name in the chat.
Thank
But
you.
he's nice. He's a nice guy, and he's very interested in collaboration. So I would check him out.
Absolutely,
But
that's really interesting. Thank you.
But the second question is, what should polyglots do? Would it help you if more of us were like Moses McCormick and learnt our community languages?
I mean, I have to say that it can't hurt. Imagine if you've moved to a new place. I don't know, so many examples come to mind. Let's say you move to London and you speak Albanian. Suddenly, there's a horrible storm, and you're aware that there's an Albanian community in London, and you speak English, native on a native level, and you speak Albanian on a native level. Why not be able to use some of those skills? I mean, I think there's plenty of opportunities for polyglots and language learners and people passionate about language to actually help their local communities, or even to deploy abroad. I know there's plenty of organizations, let's say the International Red Cross and what's happening in Ukraine. There are volunteers that I know who are going to places like Poland and Czechia, who actually speak the language. They're Americans, but also speak the language, maybe know some Russian as well, or some Ukrainian. And they're going over to volunteer to help to find, homes for the Ukrainian refugees, or finding ways to help the children get into schools, that kind of thing, helping people settle in or helping them move on to their homes or where they need to be next. So I think there's always volunteer opportunities. And you don't have to travel far too. You can look in your local community. Even if you're in a community that maybe doesn't have a lot of immigration or a lot of flux, sometimes there's minority groups or indigenous groups that live there and would also appreciate having somebody who can be an intermediary or can advocate for them, support them, in case of emergency. So there's different ways to kind of look at it, and it doesn't have to be this big, grandiose, I'm going to save the world type of thing. It can also be on a local level. But I would say even just researching opportunities, think about the languages that think about the languages you're passionate about, maybe cultures you're passionate about, and where you might be able to help. Because the key thing about emergencies is it's wonderful to be able to respond to them successfully, even though there's always going to be challenges, there's always going to be loss, it's always going to be devastating, no matter how small the impact. But the key thing is preparedness. That's going to make a big difference in terms of the communities having the information they need before a disaster strikes. So thinking about that and how can communities help? I know through my work, I'm doing some volunteering, actually a few of my colleagues are, in terms of helping community members that are maybe disadvantaged. Doesn't even have to be, that they don't speak English or speak English well, but maybe are disadvantaged. How do they put together an emergency kit in case a disaster strikes? They have a bag that they can just put on and flee their homes, and they'll have everything they need in that bag. That's super important. And not everybody has access to that, but finding ways to help, no matter how small, can be very, very impactful. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Timothy. Anybody else have questions or comments? I know we have about 18, 17 minutes. I'm happy to also hear your stories if you've experienced something or you have a friend that's experienced something. What's going on in Ukraine can also be considered an emergency. Maybe if you have questions about Hurricane Ian, since that's very much on my mind and something that I'm aware of, I can speak to that a bit too. I'll pause here. I know I've been talking quite a bit.
May I ask another question if there are no
Please,
other
please.
questions?
Yeah.
Is there a particular language that you would recommend people to learn in order to be able to help with disasters more effectively? I mean, I know that, for instance, I'm just thinking that hurricanes would affect certain parts of the world more than others, and just for one example. So, what is for which languages are there the greatest demand?
I love that question, and I feel like that's a classic polyglot question. Um, I would say that really also depends on your region and where you live, where what sort of impacts you're experiencing in your region. So for example, take me, I live in the United States. We have a very big, very diverse Hispanic population through many parts of the US, especially areas where disasters tend to strike. So for example, the Midwest, Texas, California, Southern US, Florida, there are large Hispanic populations there. So having the ability to speak Spanish, Latin American Spanish specifically, Mexican Spanish even more so, because the group that speaks, the largest group of Hispanics or Spanish speakers that we have in the United States are actually Mexican Spanish speakers. That would be helpful for me and my situation, but we can take other parts of the world. I think Southeast Asia gets frequent, not hurricanes, I think it's typhoons, which is really a similar term, a similar meaning, but maybe learning something like Indonesian could be helpful, or take Japan. If you're in East Asia, maybe learning Japanese is really helpful because they have frequent earthquakes. So it kind of depends on what you're thinking of, even in terms of the man-made disasters. They're quite tragic, so I won't necessarily get into where those can happen. It really depends. But yeah, I would say it depends very much on where you are, what region you're in, and also what you're interested in too. So for me, I think it makes sense to learn Spanish. And I am a Spanish speaker, a little rusty right now, but I do speak some Spanish. And so that would be most logical for me to learn and to be able to help people in my communities. And even where I am in the Washington, D.C. area, the capital of the US, there is a very large Central American population. And so learning maybe a dialect from that region would be quite helpful. Guatemalan or Nicaraguan or Salvadorian. All of that's helpful. So yeah, it just depends. But just wanted to give you an example of my situation as well. Does that help?
Yes, I mean, you talked about the importance of being prepared in your talk, and it appears that this is something that how we can contribute by being prepared for certain linguistic groups who unfortunately may be subject to disasters. At least, I guess, with the man-made disasters, like the one in Ukraine, I guess in some ways these can be predicted even maybe more accurately than natural disasters. I don't know, but you said it's a typical polyglot question that I was asking. Well, I'm not sure myself, to be quite honest. I don't hear this question asked very much among polyglots. What can we learn in order to help others more immediately? Now, if you learn any language, you're going to help somebody, of course.
Sure.
And learning certain language for your own sort of pleasure, for your own interest, is also going to be valuable. There's nothing wrong with it as well. But I wish that the question, which language can we learn to help people, was heard more often.
Yes,
was
this is
truly a typical question.
Yeah, this is true. And I think in terms of that question, I do hear, what language should I learn to do this? That was sort of what I was thinking, but it's true. And I think here in the polyglot community, I think people are very dedicated to learning and to speaking with people and connecting. And I think the next level of that is, okay, so I have this knowledge, I have these experiences. How can I help people? And how can I help people in the way that I'm interested in too? Because, everybody has their own skills and passions. For me, this is something that I'm interested in. This emergency management, emergency preparedness helps save people's lives. And so that's important to me. And that's a good way for me to engage. And really the language access piece, I mean, it's like the best of both worlds for my brain. I love languages and I love being able to help people. I like helping people prepare for disasters. How can I think of those two things together? And I wish I spoke more languages to be able to help more people. At the moment, I speak Czech, Albanian, Spanish and French are a little rusty. My German's really rusty, but it would be nice to be able to speak more. But Spanish is one that I've been thinking about and brushing up on, because there might be a possibility of me to be able to use it someday. I know that would be really useful. But I hope that this conversation helps people think about, how might I be able to help my community with my language knowledge? Because you might have a skill that nobody else in your community does because you decided to learn the most obscure, most interesting language. And how might you be able to use it? You could actually really help people. And again, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be helping provide some training, helping them look over some documents, helping them translate the documents. Now, it's always good to go through a proper resource. If you're feeling really confident and comfortable about translating, government paperwork, good for you. But it's also something that's really important not to make any mistakes, because it really could cause more damage than good. So going through the right channels and offering your services, offering help to volunteer. I mean, there's hundreds, dozens and hundreds of volunteer organizations where you could actually do that. So looking at things like the International Red Cross, those kinds of organizations can be really helpful. And I think there's plenty to do all over the world as well. So it's definitely an important consideration. And I appreciate, Timothy, that you've been asking all these important questions and thinking about how can I help, because I love hearing that. May I ask where you live? What part of the world are you from?
Co ty myslíš, odkud jsem?
Oh, I don't know. Oh, rozumím. Krásná čeština, děkuju moc.
Yeah. Well, já bydlím v prdele světu. Já bydlím v malém místu v severním Anglii. Ale já mám velkou slabost k slovanským jazykům. I proto já učím se ukrajinsky, abym pomohl uchodcům z Ukrajiny.
To je úžasný, to je opravdu skvělý a jsem ráda, že se vám líbí slovanské jazyky. Umíte češtinu krásně a moc mě to těší. A severní Anglie je krásné místo. Já jsem žila v Sheffieldu, tak to tam znám dost dobře.
Okay. Well, musím přiznat, že já jsem nebyl v Sheffieldě. Upřímně řečeno, já lépe znám Německu i Nizozemsku i Belgii než Velká Británie. Ačkoliv já jsem Brit, ale já znám jiný země lépe než moje vlastní země.
Rozumím. Opravdu umíte mluvit česky velice hezky. To je úžasné a je to těžký jazyk.
Můžu něco říct?
Samozřejmě.
But because I don't want to just one thing I notice is that many people who do not come from Western Europe and do not speak English or Romance language will be saying, "Oh, our language is so hard," and Czechs are no exception.
Yes,
and
true.
And I think this is one of the things that puts people off learning a lot of languages, because people keep on saying that it's hard. Now, again, I'm only thinking out loud here. I don't wish, this is just theorizing, but I suspect that because the loudest voices in the world come from Western Europe and from North America, so they keep on talking, and they think their languages are not difficult because they're quite widespread.
Yeah.
And so people are quite used to hearing them. But when they say, just because a language is not so mainstream, that doesn't mean that it isn't in itself more difficult. And I wish that people would, not say so much, our language is so difficult. And often it's the native speakers of the language that are saying this. But to be honest, how the hell can they say that? Well,
Yeah.
what makes them think that their language? So I know how many. I don't know what I could tell you how many. I've been told about 1,000 times in Polish how Polish is so difficult. No, it's not. It is not difficult. It has difficult aspects, like every language, but it is not in itself it may be more difficult to people from Western Europe who have the biggest voices worldwide than maybe French or Spanish or Italian, but it is not a reason to put you off from learning that language. You see, so I wish there was more discussion of how easy lots of languages were and what makes them easier than more mainstream languages, rather than people saying, "Oh, our native language is so hard." No, it's not. For instance, but I was just thinking, again, thinking out loud, maybe if we wanted to promote languages which are less mainstream, like the ones which are valuable in emergencies, maybe the way to teach them is actually also to teach them from a different perspective to languages which are taught, from a mainstream perspective. So have a more of an emphasis on, your community and helping people in these situations, rather than because it's such an important language worldwide for your career or whatever. Do you think there's an opening? Your work can be used as a way of popularizing languages that don't usually get enough attention?
I love that. I love that. I love that idea. And Ciro, I do see your hand, so I will ask you to share your question or comment shortly. But just to kind of think through that, and I know we're coming up on time here, to think through that. I love that idea. I think that's a fantastic way to learn a language, to just kind of localizing and rooting yourself in your community. And I know people who have actually done that. I lived in Kosovo for a little over 2 years, and I learned Albanian, which is the majority language in that country. I don't know if anybody's been. It's wonderful. People are very, very friendly there. And Albanian is a fun language. Challenging because it's not connected to any other language on the Indo-European language tree, if anybody wants to know. But I also started picking up Bosnian there because I got to know the Bosniak community. It's a minority community. Most of the Bosniaks live in the kind of the southern tip of Kosovo. It looks like a diamond with a tail. And so a lot of the Bosniaks, most of the Bosniaks actually live kind of in that tail. And so getting to know them and learning their language and learning the dialects was really, really interesting. And so that was a way that I wanted to engage with the community. I didn't learn Bosnian beforehand. I didn't really think about it until I arrived. And after time, I was able to get to know the community because I taught Bosniak students in the local school, along with Albanians. And so I think sometimes you don't realize all the different types of people and the different cultures in your community until you start connecting with them and reaching out. And then hopefully in that way, you get interested and you want to talk to them, you want to learn their language. It's having a personal touch. And I think that can make a big difference too. And that's why I think about the community level efforts and the community level volunteering and influences is get to know the people in your community. Who are the people that don't really raise their hand? Who are the voices that maybe are too afraid to speak or don't feel comfortable speaking? How can you connect with them? And so looking at those influences might be a good way to do it. I mean, for example, I mentioned the Washington, D.C. area, and I know we're coming up on time. Ciro, if you want to type your question in or pipe it in right now, I'll just quickly wrap up my sentence. But in terms of Washington, D.C., I mentioned, the Central American community that lives here is learning perhaps their dialects, knowing that they live here. I think that would be a helpful way to engage. Ciro, I know you put down your hand, but if you want to ask your question or raise your comment, and we'll have that to close because maybe this room will get occupied at 12. And if you don't have a question, that's fine too. Oh, there you go.
Oh yeah, hi.
Hi.
No, I just wanted to give like a quick example of all this. Like, I never thought of it in that way, but now I realize that actually I was living in Iceland for 6 years, like 10, 15 years ago. And back then they used phone books. I don't know if they use them anymore, but in the phone books, because Iceland is very active, like in terms of avalanches, earthquakes and all that, they had all the instructions on what to do in Icelandic, in English, and in Polish, because there were so many Polish people in Iceland who lived in their own bubble and didn't speak any other language. And like back then I was like, okay, this is a bit strange that they have that in Polish, because it's like not really, you wouldn't make the connection between Icelandic and Polish. But then like later I understood that, okay, Poland is not very active in that, like with avalanches or earthquakes, so they wouldn't know what to do when the house starts shaking. So that was just like a subtle example of of like hidden ways to include other people as well.
I love that. That's a really good example and really important too to consider from the European perspective. So thank you so much for sharing. I know we're at 12 o'clock, so I will thank you all for your time, your interest. If you have any questions, I think you can still reach out to me here in the chat. I will be popping around in other rooms for this conference, but thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, morning, whatever time it is in your location. So thank you all again, and goodbye. Have a good day.